This is Billy Kay with the history of Scottish nationalism told from within the movement, The Cause, Programme 3, Flower of Scotland.
This is Radio Free Scotland calling.
When I went to say goodbye to the Speaker, knowing I probably wouldn't be back, he just said, I want you to know, Winnie, that no one in the history of this Parliament has ever been treated as backlash.
If you became a member of the SNP, you were not joining the establishment. In those days, it was an eccentric minority.
We had one member in Ayr, we had one member in St Andrews, we had one member in Wick, we had one member in Skye. That's the kind of absurdity you're dealing with.
It was a sect. It was curiously like Trotskyism, actually, and it was something which was, at that time, a blind alley.
Tom Nairn, Jim Halliday, Winnie Ewing and Gordon Wilson, recalling the image, status and treatment of the Scottish National Party back in the 1950s and 60s, when nationalists were often regarded as objects of contempt or ridicule. Flora McCormick and Gordon Caseley.
The Cyclist Touring Club disbursed its monthly magazine, and inside was a leaflet from the Cooperative Holidays Association advertising tours to Scotland. This was embellished with wonderful words: the land of bagpipes, tartan, shortbread tins, Loch Lomond, the Scottish Nationalists. So we were actually seen as a kind of tourist target. This was in 1961.
It was part of the quaintness of Scotland in a way.
Part of a funny little tartan treasure house.
When I was first married and my children were very small, I put up posters for one of the campaigns, and a neighbour came to me and said, "You're Scottish Nationalists?" And I said, "Yes." And they said, "But I've never met a Scottish nationalist before, and you're such nice people." It just goes to show there's loads of them about now.
The SNP had no power because people didn't take them serious. They were just a joke. And other people that doctors or solicitors, they used to look down on us.
The Saltire now is universally seen. When I was a boy, when did any of us ever see a Saltire? I remember at the time of the coronation, when Scotland was awash with Union flags everywhere, I noticed a Saltire away down the road, and I asked my old man about it, and he said, "Oh, that's so-and-so. He's a hairy-kneed Scottish nationalist."
I did a report for Edinburgh branch of the SNP, and I handed it in at the Herald office in Edinburgh, and the journalist on duty took it and said, "I'll send it through to Glasgow, I'll give them a laugh anyway." And I thought, how ignorant a remark. What we're talking about was material about Scotland and its nationhood.
When I came to work in Dundee College of Education, two things happened. First of all, I was always introduced each year as each term began to new classes that I was to register. Our vice principal would say, "You'll go with Mr. Halliday. Mr. Halliday's a Scottish nationalist." And that's how he put it.
To declare yourself a nationalist or to talk for independence for Scotland was, frankly, a social embarrassment.
In these early days, it wasn't unusual for me perhaps to find one or two nationalists in an evening, whole evening, one or two. I remember ringing the doorbell once and somebody said, "Oh, quick," calling his wife, "here's somebody from the Scottish National Party having a joke."
I remember we went canvassing with a friend of mine, Archie Young, to this house, and the lady answered the door and asked would we come in and help her lay a carpet. Which we did. And then, well, sure, she went away and voted Labour.
I remember leafleting in Marchmont in Edinburgh, and I was so frightened of the reaction when they picked up the leaflet that I had put through the letterbox. Sometimes they came out and shouted at you, and I would climb to the third floor and come down as quickly as possible so that I was out of the building before they picked up the leaflet.
I was in a pub selling the Scots Independent. The Salvation Army war cry was much more popular. But somebody eventually took it, and as he took it, he dropped it. And I leant down, being a young, naive individual, and handed it, and he said, "Sonny," he said, "I could have kicked you in the face." So that was an object lesson about the dangers of canvassing. And I was very grateful that he chose to tell me and not to put it into effect.
Giving up a Saturday afternoon from the football and other boyish sports, I thought I was doing a wee bit for the common weal, handing out these postcards through doors. I remember this chap, charging down his garden, holding up this postcard saying, "You should be ashamed of yourself. You should be ashamed of yourself." And I thought, goodness, why should I be ashamed of myself? You know? But that was the perception at that time. It was disloyal.
John Mackay, Rennie McCowan and Alan McKinney, going against the grain of what was still a very British and unionist society, following Britain's united stance against fascism in the Second World War. Even your wee boy could be the enemy within.
I joined the SNP when I was still a schoolboy. That was 1959. And some days later, my old man, who was in the police and who'd been in special branch in the early 1950s, the old man collared me and he wasn't pleased. "You a member of the Scottish Nationalists?" "Yes, Dad." Well, a colleague in special branch had tipped him off that somebody of his surname had joined. And that shows you just how feared we were in those days. Nationalists weren't welcome in any company, in any social stratum then at all.
As with the 1820 radical rising, the state employed agents provocateurs to ensnare potential troublemakers. As a law-abiding nationalist student in the 1950s, Jim Halliday was approached by one who offered explosives expertise and suggested targets.
Well, he said the best thing you could do, I think, is to blow up the bridges at Berwick. So I thought, oh boy, we've got a right one here.
The Glasgow students declined responding.
Don't know whether you're a journalist looking for a story or a government spy looking for a victim. I think it's the latter. We never saw him again. A year later, 4 Edinburgh students were tried and jailed for planning to blow up the General Post Office in Edinburgh. And they had been put up to it by a special constable who was a taxi driver. When people then say, oh, I don't think that sort of thing happens, I said, well, I assure you, it did.
Stoking the authorities' fear of nationalism in the 50s was the attack on pillar boxes proclaiming the Queen as Elizabeth II, when Scotland, of course, had never had an Elizabeth I. This annoyed Scottish Royalists and Republicans. Peter Wright.
Jock was famous. He'd put a brick through a window in Kirkcaldy that had an E2R sign at the time of the great kerfuffle at Lizzie's coronation. He was enough a man, but a great nationalist.
E1R, E2R. Well, I was in primary 5 at school, age 9. I was leader of the E1R faction. To me, I felt insulted that we were having E2R.
As my friend Jim Halliday said, you can't have a second cup of tea if you've not had a first. We were getting lumbered with a second cup of tea, and we didn't like it.
Another thing they didn't like and were no longer prepared to fold from 1956 onwards was the banishing of the SNP from the airwaves. Mary McCabe.
You would get the BBC closing down, playing God Save the Queen, and if people were able to stick through God Save the Queen, Radio Free Scotland came in on that airwave.
The BBC in those days was highly civilised. It ended transmissions round about 11 o'clock at night, and that allowed us then to come in with the Radio Free Scotland call sounds, which were the police pipe band in Edinburgh playing Scotland the Brave. Then it was followed by me or somebody else intoning Radio Free Scotland, this is Radio Free Scotland calling. And then you would get the Grand March My Ida, because the BBC had a carrier wave that you had to wait until it got out of the way.
The SNP, because it only stood in Scotland, was completely cut out and didn't get any broadcasting time. So, to get round this, they set up a pirate radio station called Radio Free Scotland.
Radio Free Scotland was a nationalist radio station, and it was there with a purpose to bring the cause of independence to the attention of the Scottish people. It was a pirate station, definitely not legal, and it predated Radio Carolina and the others that were moored offshore. The people in charge of transmission, of course, didn't have the benefit of being in a boat out of range of the British Navy. They were camped out in top flaps with aerials dangling, and they were transmitting the programmes from there.
They had to keep moving all the equipment and everything from house to house because it was quite easy to locate a transmitter. So the police and everybody was out there trying to find this Radio Free Scotland, which was flitting from house to house to house to house.
It was a magazine format of about 18-20 minutes. It was there to entertain, but of course it had a purpose, and the purpose was that nasty, dreadful word, propaganda.
In those days, in the SNP, you had to bend the law a wee bit because the law was manifestly unfair to us.
The music was a mixture. We had Elvis Presley and other such. A limited range because it depended on the record libraries of impecunious students. And part of it was Scottish, particularly Scottish folk songs, because in the 1960s and late 50s, the Scottish folk song revival was taking place, and it was very attractive to young people.
One of the most important things in the early development of nationalism, in the 60s in particular, was the expansion of folk clubs. At 8 time in Fife, I could have gone to a different folk club every night of the week. That was one way of bringing folk into the nationalist movement, where words and song was important and the message got over, in a way that hardline politics maybe wouldn't. And then, of course, did the Corries no come up with Floor of Scotland.
Those days are past now, and in the past they must remain. But we can still rise now and be the nation again that stood against him. Proud Edward's army and sent him home while they think again.
Eventually, through growing cultural and political pressure, the rules for party political broadcasts were changed in the mid-60s, and for the first time, the SNP had access to the persuasive power of television in 1965, and the effect of Billy Wolfe's broadcast was immediate.
The result, again, of the first broadcast was incredible. We had over 1,000 people writing into party headquarters wanting information about the SNP. During the period of the 60s, though, the membership of the party doubled every year. And that meant that we began getting a lot more weight, a lot more money, because the Alba Pools was set up by Angus McGilvery, and it brought in money which at one stage, in today's terms, might have been close to £1 million. And the reasons why it was happening, the industrial rundown of Scotland, the end of the British Empire, lots of reasons came together, including pro-Scottish ones.
The collapse of Britishness, really, which has now sunk to a condition unimaginable even in the 1950s. Everyone admitted that the empire was over.
Tom Nairn on the change in attitude to identity that was also gaining momentum. The SNP too had to transform its organisation to keep pace. Gordon Wilson and Peter Lynch of Stirling University.
When it came to choosing candidates, there were very few people to choose from in terms of numbers, and I have to say too in terms of inclination, because nobody likes being duffed up. It's not good for the ego. So in the Bridgeton by-election, for example, the party chose Ian MacDonald, who was a farmer in Ayrshire. There had been no farming done in Bridgeton for some 200 years. I mean, he was enthusiastic, and he had a record of setting up branches in other parts of the country. So he jacked in farming for politics and became the national organiser on virtually no money at all.
MacDonald was basically like a travelling salesman for the SNP. And he went up and down Scotland to all these different areas, forming branches. He'd receive information, a phone call, a letter with a group of people interested in forming the SNP in this area, and he would then go out on the road and tour around year after year, forming all these organisations from scratch. At the start of the 60s, you're maybe looking at an SNP of 22, 23 branches. By the time MacDonald's gone through the places, you're talking about hundreds upon hundreds of them. And it's the determination by him to go and do it that he realised, oh, you have to be a bit of an evangelist here, but actually you don't have to be that much of an evangelist because people want this, but the commitment to go and do it time after time after time after time in all these remote places all across Scotland, that's what really makes it, and that's how they build a structure of thousands upon thousands of members.
We arranged to have an open-air meeting at the Portbrae in Kirkcaldy, around about 1916 this must have been. There was a couple of hundred folk turned up for it, and all we'd done was whitewash the streets saying, Nationalist meeting, Portbrae. It was a big deal to get something restarted in Kirkcaldy.
First guy I got interested with SNP was Bruce Cookey, because he was a school teacher from Aberdeen. So the bus stop was outside my restaurant, and he would come in to me for a sandwich and a famous coffee, and he would jump. But in the meantime, my accountant was Charlie Reid, and he became my accountant till 1980. So you can imagine he was pushing SNP up my logs all the time. Now, at the same time, Douglas Henderson came into the scene. I gave him actually an office in my hotel. I called it Caledonian after Hail Caledonia, as Burns went over the barrack course and looked over his shoulder. And then I bought a Royal Hotel and I started Peterhead Engineering. And of course, you're dealing with ordinary folk is needing an opportunity to work. And of course, this is running parallel to the SNP policy. Get there, believe in yourself. You're as good as the next boy, if no better, especially if you work 7 days a week.
Ron Ferrari of Peterhead in the northeast, which became a nationalist heartland. But all over Scotland, there was a surge in nationalist sentiment. Rennie McCohen remembers the 1960s in his hometown.
Well, when I was a trainee reporter in Stirling, I watched the Bannockburn Day Parade, wrote reports about it. But the procession was put in lines of twos to make it look longer. And then I was seconded down to England for 3 years. But when I came back after to visit my parents, I found it was Bannockburn Day, which I'm ashamed to say I'd forgotten. And I watched the parade. There were thousands there, it seemed. Winnie Ewing was there marching at the head of the parade. And I thought, this is real politics and real emotion. And I went out to my parents' house in Menstrie and told them that was my view. And I got sympathetic comments from my parents. The first time I'd ever heard them say anything about nationalism.
The Bannockburn Rally is no longer a huge event organised by the SNP, but people still come here every year on the anniversary. I asked them why.
Because our history has been stolen and we have to fight to get our history back. I'm an ex-history teacher, retired, and history teachers can't teach Scottish history because they haven't taught it themselves. Scots are brainwashed, our culture's been smashed, our history's been smashed, and it's not so much the English, it's Scots themselves, full of self-loathing for their own culture, their own history. It's political, it's cultural, it's historical.
To show my support for independence and Scottish nationalism, and also for what our ancestors did here in 1314 for the freedom cause.
Ready to fight and die for freedom then. All we have to do now is vote for it. Just a wee cross, vote yes.
We're patriots, we're Scottish and we're Templar, so we feel it a privilege to come here to Bannockburn. We believe in the freedom of Scotland, and it's not just economics, social development, etc. All these are important, but you've got to have the heart and soul, and that's what we're here for, try and be at one with the heart and soul of the nation.
I went every year. I spoke usually. Very precious memories. Such wonderful people I met. And they were people that risked their jobs often. They had no security if they joined the SNP. I was lost in admiration.
It was a checkered history during the 1960s. We had good results and bad results. So morale was sky high, followed by deep manic depression. But you took that in your stride because you started out, you see, by not having any hopes anyway. This was a matter of conviction and principle and doing what you thought was right. And as for having a career in politics, forget it.
However, to paraphrase an iconic song of the period, the times they were a-changin'. And in 1967 in Hamilton, the catalyst was a charismatic lawyer called Winnie Ewing. Jim Lynch, editor of the Scots Independent.
The first time I saw Winnie Ewing was at the Aberdeen conference, and Winnie come down the aisle and she had a shocking pink trouser suit on. She positively radiated. The place went mad, Oh, a magical feeling. I've never felt like that since.
Now, one possible pitfall for a nationalist candidate in the west of Scotland back then was getting on the wrong side of the sectarian divide. Alan McInnes of Strathclyde University.
When I was a boy growing up in the Highlands, there was an identification with home rule means Rome rule. And then when I came to Glasgow, I remember having grown up with this belief that nationalists and Compton Mackenzie of this world, home rule and Rome rule, standing on the slopes of Parkhead to hear this vitriol of the SNP as a bunch of Protestants.
It's just slurs by people who don't know what they're talking about. Home rule and Rome rule is a hangover from the Irish problem, of course.
Winifred Margaret Woodburn, though, had a perfectly balanced ticket, beginning with her family link to a Rangers legend.
I was Willie Woodburn's second cousin, and my election agent was a very devout Catholic, charming man, related actually to Nationalist, McAteer by name. So that balanced it a bit.
She clearly expected to win, and with my experience, being quite to the contrary. I thought, do your best, dear lady, and I'm sure you'll do well, but talk about a glass ceiling, the SNP is going to bang its head. And she listens to me and she said, but Jimmy, I'm going to win.
I wasn't a daft dreamer. I really got the impression I had enough people wanting me in to win the seat.
Winifred Margaret Ewing, Scottish Nationalist. 18,397.
Once I won, people couldn't believe it, and people kept arriving all that night.
My goodness, excited they were, especially at the Zambezi Hotel, where I think the excitement by that stage may have been fuelled by some artificial stimulation.
Things were never the same again, and her victory meant that we stopped being bystanders. All of a sudden, there was a degree of being taken that wee bit more seriously. A wee nudge of the earth, a wee earthquake.
Throughout the country, where Winnie went round, there were meetings of 1,000 people or more in party headquarters. The day after the election, there was a queue of people outside the door, snaking their way in, wanting to join.
And it seemed as if most of them turned up to see Winnie off when the Tartan Express left for London.
The whole of the central station was packed with people singing Nationalist songs, playing bagpipes. My father had always told me that he'd been to see the Red Clydesiders off, and I felt a kind of bond with them, thinking, well, it's just history repeating itself. I felt very proud of that.
And had Jimmy Maxton not said something about a Scottish Parliament when he left?
Oh, yeah.
They would come back eventually with a Scottish Parliament.
Oh, yeah. I was able to quote that.
And then, of course, we went down the train, the Tartan Express to London, and I remember everyone was exhilarated. I was absolutely exhausted. At that time, of course, at the age of 10, I didn't really realise that my mother had made history.
There was no sleep in that train. I don't think I slept at all.
Were you singing?
Oh, everyone was singing.
It was a giant ceilidh. And not just in the train, I think throughout Scotland. I think my mother captivated a mood at the time, a mood that was wanting something more, something better for Scotland. And she reflected that mood, of course.
Fergus Ewing. Meanwhile, at Westminster, according to Oliver Brown, a shudder went through the Scottish members of Parliament, frantically looking for a spine to run up. Now, Winnie was used to dealing with local MPs in her role as secretary of the Glasgow Bar Association, but she was quite unprepared for the hostility her victory unleashed. Professor James Mitchell of Strathclyde University.
So long as the SNP was still a marginal force, the Labour Party didn't mind it. And of course, for a long period of time, right up till after the Second World War, you could be a member of both the SNP and the Labour Party, and that was commonly the case. So there wasn't the same animosity in this period. That's what happened later, when the SNP started to take the votes away from the Labour Party. Then we really do see animosity between these two parties.
It never occurred to me that that goodwill I'd always experienced would suddenly momentously change.
The Scottish Labour MPs were frightened because if Hamilton could fall, a lot of their fortresses could go likewise.
They were vicious. I was an enemy, but they didn't stand for Labour anymore. They'd given it up anyway. My father had never given it up. I knew they were sham people. I had utter contempt for them all. And they knew that, of course. And you see, what they couldn't go over was I had friends that went way back, quite distinguished members of the Labour hierarchy in the Lords. Right. That annoyed the Labour Party terribly.
They had their jobs and careers in Westminster, and they did not like it.
The Tories were always kind, the Liberals were always kind, the English were always kind, the Welsh were always kind, and the Irish were always kind. The only exceptions to the rule of chivalry, which was very strong, was the Labour Party from the Central Belt. And they were not kind. Sometimes I was followed in the House of Commons at dark. When the House put the lights out, you were in darkness then, but you knew your way and there were certain lights. I was followed at dark of night by members of the Labour Party.
To intimidate you?
Yes, I was intimidated. I lost a stone in weight. I became very worried about my weight and I really had a problem then. I was down to about 7 stone. in the House of Commons.
Winnie could well handle herself in the cut and thrust of Glasgow courts, but this type of abuse was unprecedented and was only stopped when her old Labour connections got to hear about it.
I had a friend at court who was the son-in-law of Keir Hardy, Emrys Hughes, and one day Emrys said he didn't like the way they behaved in open court in the House. But I said, but Emrys, that's nothing to the way they behave not in the House. And I told Emrys about followed it in dark of night. He says, what? Come with me. Way into Harold Wilson's room. Emrys told Harold Wilson what I'd told him, and Harold Wilson said this will stop instantly. And it did.
Next in the cause, I'll look at nationalism and the devolution debate of the 70s, but I'll leave you with the voices of people politicised in the 60s, for whom nothing would ever be the same again. For Mary McCabe, it began with a topical debate at high school.
That the SNP deserved their recent near win in Pollock. And he said, do you mind speaking for that? And it was only when I said yes, and then panicked because I'd never spoken in public before and had to try and make a speech together, I realised that the person speaking against the motion was my boyfriend. And so the two of us were up there, you know, at each other's throats in public about this issue. I won. He started arguing with me afterwards about it, and I thought, there isn't room in my life here for both this boyfriend and Scottish nationalism. So I dumped him and joined the party.
And have you ever regretted this?
Absolutely not. Never. I have never had a moment's doubt since then about Scottish independence.
After winning his election, that was the catalyst. I remember to this day David Lomax, BBC reporter, pooh-hooing the idea that Scotland could do anything by itself. In other words, he was saying Scots are always dependent on the English, and I found that absolutely abhorrent, and still do. We've been told we're subservient, we are dependent on the English for financial support. I find that so insulting. At that stage, I was prepared to accept a reduction in my standard of living to achieve the objective, because I thought Scots should be looking after their own affairs, full stop.
You're doing your bit for Scotland. Independence was going to come the morning. I mean, if I could see the truth at Saxton or whoever was at the time, then surely, the Scots would see the truth. Independence was round the corner, but it's taken a wee bit longer. But maybe now it might just be round the corner. No yet, but maybe the morning.